Hey guys, welcome to the Veteran Outdoorsman channel. And today we're going to discuss an iconic cartridge that is still going after over 120 years. The 3030 Winchester or 30 Winchester centerfire. Let's go into a little bit of history of the cartridge, and then I'm going to discuss my experiences with it, what I like, what I don't like, and why you may like or not like the cartridge. It's a classic. It speaks for itself. Originating in 1895. Many will say, no, 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 it started in 1894, but that's not true. It started in the 1894 Winchester, but the 1894 was originally chambered in 3855 and 3240 Ballard. In 1895, Winchester had strong enough steel and whatnot to use smokeless powder. It was a 30 caliber, is a 30 caliber cartridge, 308 caliber, and it used at the time 30 grains of the new, fairly new at the time, smokeless powder, hence the nomenclature 3030. But Winchester called it the 30 WCF, 30 Winchester centerfire. The 3030 came from companies like Marlin, eventually Remington, etc., that didn't want to give Winchester free advertising. So Marlin started calling it the 3030. But it's the same cartridge. That nomenclature eventually stuck. I believe Winchester quit using the 30 Winchester centerfire sometime in the 40s and went to the 3030 like everyone else did. And now it is known as the 3030. It was the first sporting cartridge to use smokeless powder. At its time, it was considered a barn burner. 160 grain round or flat nose bullet at just under 2,000 feet per second. I believe 1960 is what they claim, 1,960 feet per second. I believe that's what's claimed, but right around 2,000 feet per second with a 160 grain bullet. These are velocities that were basically unheard of, except for military cartridges, such as the Mauser cartridges, the 303 British, some others of the day. It was a barn burner. It was chambered in a lightweight, strong, reliable lever action rifle, the Winchester 94, the Winchester 1894 at the time. Light, well balanced. There were a lot of things that people really liked about this cartridge. The flatter trajectory over traditional cartridges of the day, such as the 3240, 3855, 4440, 3840, 3220, 4570, etc., and various muzzleloaders that were still being used somewhat at the time. The trajectory was like a laser beam in comparison. You now had a cartridge that, with minimal holdover, could take deer-sized game out to 200 yards if the shooter did their part and the rifle was accurate enough. Well, the guys killed buffalo at 4, 5, 600 yards. Yes, they did, with large cartridges from 4570 all the way up to 5110. But a large animal, large heavy bullets, and they had to compensate for the yardage. The plus those long range shots weren't as common as many people think. But the 3030 allowed you to at least out to 150 yards just hold dead on, and with minimal holdover, with the right rifle, a good aperture style sight to be accurate enough to take whitetail size game out to around 200 yards. This cartridge became the go-to for white-tailed deer, pronghorn antelope, mule deer. It was taken out west to kill elk. Many moose fell to this cartridge and still do today in Alaska and Canada. Over the years, the 160 grain bullet was basically dropped in favor of a 150 like this and a 170 grain bullet. Those are the two most common bullets chambered today. You will also find chamberings as low as 125 grains, I believe, and up to, in buffalo bore ammunition, up to 190. All standard manufacturers make the ammo for it. Like I said, buffalo bore makes it. Corbon might even make it, but don't quote me on that. I believe PMC did at one point, but I know Remington, Winchester, Federal, Hornady all chamber ammunition in the 30-30. The standard chamberings or standard offerings, again, being 150 grain or 170 grain. Hornady several years ago began offering the 160 grain flex tip, allowing a pointed high ballistic coefficient bullet to be shot in a tubular magazine. More on that in a minute. And they also offer 140 grain monolithic flex tip. Many of the companies I mentioned chamber a 150 grain Barnes X bullet. There's been some very tough bullets made for this cartridge. The 150 grain Barnes X being one of them, and the 170 grain Nosler Partition being another. There are bonded bullets, there's standard cup and core bullets, there's partition bullets, there's tipped bullets like the Hornady flex tip bullets, and also Winchester ballistic silver tips, and I believe there's even a deer season. I believe there's a deer season load also with polymer tips. Those are rounded tips. The only pointed one that I'm aware of that's factory loaded is the Hornady, and it's got a soft rubber tip, but it does increase ballistic efficiency. More on that in a minute. My personal experience with the 30-30 is in Winchester and Marlin lever actions. I've owned two Winchester 94s and a Marlin 336. One of the 94s, I couldn't really speak for accuracy. All I ever did was shoot soda cans out to about 25 or 30 yards with it, and it was iron sights. But it was a reliable gun. It was a really beat up gun, but it was a reliable gun. The two guns that I have most experience with, my current 94, that's over 120 years old, and a Winchester 336W that I had many years ago. Both of those with the right ammunition, capable of 1 inch or less groups at 100 yards. My current setup with 170 grain core lock bullets, I shoot about 1.5 inch group at 100 yards. And I do, like many lever actions, I do have a little bit of an issue with vertical stringing as the barrel gets warm. There's ways to address that, but with that group size for that rifle and no further than I want to shoot, I haven't felt a need to address it. But I did with a Tang sight and these 150 grain Federal bullets. I was able to achieve groups of less than 1 inch at 100 yards on multiple occasions with 150 grain core locks out of the 30 yards. Out of the 336, I was able to to obtain around 1-inch groups with a fixed 4-power scope on that rifle. Now I've got a long eye relief um, scope on my current 30-30. I'm getting around 1.5-inch groups. I'm still getting used to long eye relief scope. That's part of it, but it shoots very well. Low recoil. The 30-30 with the right rifle has very manageable recoil and has been used for years to introduce young shooters to big game hunting. The only thing I would caution you with that is many lever actions are lighter weight and tend to have a hard butt plate. My current Model 94 with a steel butt plate is manageable and doesn't bruise my shoulder or anything, though I feel it. But my 12-year-old daughter would not find it very fun to shoot. But with a slim recoil pad over it, now I have just a leather pouch as part of the sling over it. It makes it feel much more comfortable. A thin slip-on recoil pad, a jacket with a shoulder pad or something like that for a young or small frame shooter could be advantageous. So that's something to think about. The guns are fairly light as a general rule. The Marlins tend to be between a half a pound and a pound heavier than the Winchesters if you're going that route. If you want to introduce a young shooter, you may want to go with a slightly heavier gun. The new Henrys tend to be a little heavier, etc., etc. Generally chambered in lever action rifles, but has been chambered in a myriad of pumps, bolt actions, single shots, and I believe even some double rifles. I believe that I know there were some German drillings with a shotgun barrel and a 30-30 barrel, but I believe that EAA, European American Arms, had over-under double barrels in 30-30, but don't quote me on that. I know they did make single shots. New England Firearms and H&R made single shots in 30-30 for years, though they no longer manufacture those. There's plenty of them out there to find. A cousin of mine has, I believe he still has it, but had for years a youth model combo with a 20 gauge barrel and a 30-30 barrel, and he deer hunted with it for years. My grandfather killed a lot of deer with an old Savage or Stevens, I don't remember which, there were both, bolt action in 30-30, and several deer with a Marlin lever action in 30-30. Very few deer camps in wooded areas will be without at least one shooter with some sort of lever action chambered in 30-30. Mild recoil, fairly flat trajectory for average deer shots. Most deer are shot within 100 yards. Even out west, typically under 200 yards. Yes, plenty of guys take shots 300, 400, 500 yards, and you may need that. But the average shot distance tends to be under 200 yards for white-tailed deer. People have taken pronghorn, etc. If you need to reach out a little bit further, there are some options. Like I said, the ballistic silver tips, things like that, do have slightly better ballistic coefficients, a little flatter shooting, but they're still around those bullets. But Hornady came out with the FTX with a nice, sleek, pointed bullet, boat tail design, 160 grains. I don't know the exact velocity numbers, but when sighted in 3 inches high at 100 yards, I believe the drop at 300 was somewhere around 9 inches, something like that, and still had enough energy to kill a white-tailed deer, making it a viable 300-yard gun. And don't quote me on that drop, but there's a lot of articles out there to look up that ammunition. It makes it a very viable option, at least to 250 yards, and within the right hands out to 300 yards. Typically, a 30-30 is a 150 to 200 yard gun. With 150 grain bullets sighted in 2.5 to 3 inches high at 100 yards, you're just shy of 200 with your point blank range on a 6-inch kill zone, giving you a little bit of leeway either way. With a 170 grain bullet, you're probably closer to 175. A 200 yard shot would be feasible if you knew the range with minimal holdover. 170 grain bullets sometimes fail to penetrate out at those distances, not penetrate, sorry, to expand out at those distances because they're going so much slower. 170 grain bullet out of a 24-inch test barrel is 2,200 feet per second versus 150 at 2,400. And out of a 20-inch barrel, it typically becomes around 2,200, sometimes as high as 23 for a 150, and somewhere between 2,000 and 2,100 for a 170. So it's not very fast. But how does it work on big game? I've got some anecdotes that I've heard from friends. I've got some personal experience, so let me share. I don't remember the exact load, but I have a friend that has killed 3 deer with a 30-30, one with a Model 94, 2 with a 336. And the results have been shoot the deer, it runs 20, 30 yards, dies. My grandfather used it for years. That's what he always said. You shoot it, it runs a short distance, it dies. I decided to try it out for myself. I'd never killed a deer. Though I've deer hunting for 30 years, I've never killed a deer with a 30-30 until this year. We had an early antlerless season. I took out my Winchester 94 and did some work with it. I shot it with these 150 grains and I liked them, but I was down to my last box. I had a couple of boxes of 170s, so I tried them. They shot well. I had more ammunition, so I stuck with my 170s, sighted about 2 inches high at 100 yards. Again, about 1.5 inches grew, between 1.5 inches and 2 inches, mainly because I didn't have a good rest and because I'm still getting used to long hourly scope. But I was happy with that. I wasn't going to shoot probably past 150 yards, and that was more than good enough. I shot a large white-tailed doe, probably somewhere around 110 pounds field dress, maybe a little bigger, at a distance of about 40 to 50 yards. Broadside, I hit her about that far up from the bottom of the chest, right in the armpit area. The thumbnail will show the picture and you can see the shot. Right through the top of the heart. Didn't physically hit the heart, just hit all the arteries and things above it, severing all of them. She mule kicked like a heart shot deer generally does, ran up a hill and got just out of sight. I heard her crash. She ran about 40 yards. I found her piled up stone dead. When I cut her open, decent sized holes in the lungs, an exit wound, probably a little bigger than a nickel, and all of the arteries and veins cut off of the top of the heart, meaning that the heart was now pumping to nothing, ending in a very quick death. I was impressed. Minimal meat loss. I'm used to shooting a 30-06 with 150 grain bullets, and there's typically a large amount of damage due to the velocity of that cartridge. With these 170 grain core locks, that was not the case, and I've heard 150s still um, have minimal meat loss, but 170s you can eat all the way to the hole. It was very effective. This is the only deer that I've ever killed with a 30-30, but it won't be the last, and I will hunt with it more this year. So some takeaways from this. This is a cartridge with moderate recoil that's good out to at least 200 yards on deer-sized game. It has been used to take game the size of elk and moose. Generally, it is considered you should keep your shots 100 yards and less for animals of that size. For mule deer, personally, I would say probably under 150 yards. And I would stick with broadside shots on anything larger than a whitetail. It's been used for feral hogs, black bears over bait, or treed with dogs, and is considered great for that. I don't have any experience with those. My main experience big game hunting is whitetails, and this thing more than fills the bill for whitetails. Flat enough trajectory to kill game out to 150 to 200 yards, which will take care of 90% of the whitetail hunter situations. Mild recoil could be used for less experienced younger shooters. I wouldn't recommend it for use under the age of 12 or 13. But for teenagers, for introducing your wife to deer hunting, just inexperienced people that don't have a lot of experience with recoil and whatnot, it certainly kicks less than most shotguns. Can be a good cartridge for that. If you're somewhat recoil sensitive and don't like to shoot a 30-06 or a 270 or something like that, it could be a good option for you. If you hunt mainly in wooded terrain and don't get shots much over 100 yards, you will never need anything more than a 30-30. And that would work for black bear hunters, elk hunters, etc. If you're not getting shots over 100 yards, your 30-30 will take care of it all. Again, with larger game, you may want to be careful with your bullet selection and your shot selection. Keep broadside shots. Use a tougher bullet, such as a Barnes X or a Nosler Partition. Though, that being said, when I finally do get to go out west and go elk hunting, my primary rifle is going to be my 30-06 with some sort of 180 grain bullet. But my backup is going to be my 30-30 with 170 grain core locks. And I am plenty confident that within 100 yards, I'll be able to take elk. But it's going to be a backup. I'm only going to use it if something happens to my main rifle, or maybe if we're hunting in really thick woods and going a long distance, and I want a lighter rifle to carry. The main allure to a 30-30 is the rifles that it's chambered in. Generally lever actions, blued steel, walnut, classic American deer rifles. The Winchester 94 chambered in 30-30. There's been over 7 million Winchester 94s built, and most of them chambered in 30-30. The classic American deer rifle, and probably the most common configuration being a carbine with a 20-inch round barrel. Light, around 6.5 pounds, I believe, maybe a little lighter. Well balanced, even with the long eye relief scope. Mine balances really well just with your hand just under the receiver. A cartridge is only as good as the rifle that it's chambered in. And if it's not accurate and good handling and whatnot, you're not going to like the cartridge. The 3030 has been chambered in a myriad of rifles, like I mentioned earlier. Got a cousin that recently came into a bolt action. There's been pumps chambered. I have a friend who has a Savage pump chambered in 3030 that he's killed a number of deer with, and he's loaned it to friends that didn't have deer rifles, and they've killed deer with it. It's been chambered in single shots, like I mentioned earlier. And if you like to hand load and you're careful in marking your ammunition, etc., you can squeeze a little bit more power, a little bit more range out of it. Guys have been loading 130 and 150 grain ballistic tips in a 3030 in Thompson Center Encores and Contenders for years and reaching out to 300 yards with them and having great success. Factory ammunition is available just about anywhere. Walmart, local sporting goods stores, gas stations that sell ammunition will have the 3030. Just about anywhere that sells ammunition will have 3030 bullets, and typically both bullet weights, 170 and 150. As a general rule, with the standard cup and core style bullets, such as these federal non-typicals, I believe they are, or Remington core locks or Winchester power points, if you keep, you need to shoot them, make sure, but if you keep the bullet weight the same, they tend to shoot about the same point of impact, but your mileage may vary on that. One big advantage of the 3030 is you don't need premium bullets because it doesn't shoot fast enough to blow up the bullets. A standard cup and core bullet shot at really high velocities can shed its jacket and really limit penetration, fragment, whatnot. Typically, when you get above 30-06, a standard cup and core bullet isn't always a good idea. Unless you use a heavier bullet, 150 grain core locked or power point out of a 300 Winchester Magnum shot at close range can be devastating, but it typically blows up. Not the case with the 3030. You typically get a mushroom and penetration all the way to the far ribs, if not an exit. With a 170 grain bullet, I got a nice exit. Most of the deer I've examined that were shot with 150 grain bullets either exited or were found just inside the hide. And those shots ranged from 25 to about 100 yards with standard ammunition. Great cartridge. Fairly inexpensive. You can find it for $25 a box or so. At one point it was much cheaper, but we all know the state of ammunition right now. That's still fairly inexpensive for rifle ammunition. Easy to find, like I said. The 3030 has a reputation for being inaccurate. And it's not really fair to the 3030 because it's not that the cartridge is inaccurate, it's that most of the rifles chambered in it have standard iron sights, and most people don't want to put a scope on it because it hinders some of the handling characteristics of a nice, sleek, lever-action rifle. If you were to put a receiver sight or a tang sight on it, you extend your sight radius and greatly increase your potential accuracy. I have achieved 1 inch and less groups with a tang sight on a 20-inch barrel carbine by making my sight radius much longer. So there's an option, and it keeps your handling characteristics the same, but you can always mount a low power scope on it. If you have a top eject, you can use a long eye relief scope. I wouldn't recommend a side mount because they're cattywampus, and they really do throw the handling characteristics off. But the long eye relief mounted forward adds a little bit of forward weight, which really helps with a swing on a moving target, which is often done with a lever action 30-30 or a low power standard scope on a gun that can top mount, such as a Marlin 336, an angle eject Winchester 94, a Mossberg 464, or the new Henry or the Rossi lever action. They can all handle a scope mounted directly over the receiver, and something in the neighborhood of a 2-7 by 32, um, or a fixed 2.5 power or something like that. Doesn't add a whole lot of weight, adds some versatility, and certainly adds to the accuracy potential of the rifle. I've not shot a single scope 30-30, regardless of action type, that wasn't capable of acceptable accuracy under 2 inches at 100 yards, typically under 1.5 inches. And the Marlins I've shot were all capable of under 1 inch. I haven't shot one yet that I couldn't get an inch grip with the right loads. Some loads may expand it a little bit more, but find the right ammunition, the one your rifle likes. So accuracy is not an issue. Decent trajectory out to 200 yards, mild recoil, inexpensive ammunition with standard bullets, fairly easy to reload from my understanding. Components, easy to find, and it's been around for over 120 years. It has killed probably all big game animals in North America. I don't know of anyone that shot a muskox with one, but I know that it's been used for moose, elk, caribou, pronghorns, mule deer, whitetails for sure, feral hogs. I have seen a video of a guy killing an American bison with one. I wouldn't recommend that, but it did work. And I have read several articles where guys did shoot grizzly or brown bears with them. And black bears, it's considered a good cartridge for baited or treed black bears. So though not ideal, it has been used to take all North American game, and I would say probably the majority of plains game in Africa and many critters in Europe and other countries. I'm on some forums where guys shoot them in Australia at various things, from feral hogs to goats to red stags, etc., in Australia and New Zealand. Let's talk a little bit more about factory ammunition that's available. I think at one point somebody offered 110 grain bullets, but I've seen 125s in both light recoil and standard velocity loadings. And the 125s in standard velocity loading is something like 25 or 2,600 feet per second. Gives it quite a bit of pop, but not so much that it would overexpand, so it would still be a decent option for whitetail and smaller game. Probably pretty good for pronghorns since they tend to be smaller, and it would make a good load for coyotes and things and not cause undue damage to the hide. The standard 150 grain bullet, again, a little more velocity, expands a little better at longer range because of the velocity. A little milder recoil than the 170s, but it's not much different. And then the 170s. And then if you really want to get up there, you want to hunt elk or moose or something like that, and you want it to be your primary gun, Buffalo Boar offers a really hot 190 grain bullet And they offer it as like bear protection, things like that. But it certainly worked for elk and whatnot. And I have seen videos of guys killing moose, elk, etc. with that load. Many elk have been killed with the 160 grain flex tip bullet from Hornady in their Hornady Liver Revolution ammo. Um, and it's a good performing bullet out of that cartridge. I don't have any experience with it out of a 30-30, but with a 200 grain 35 caliber bullet and 35 Remington, it was awesome on white-tailed deer. And I took my two largest whitetails to date with that cartridge. So I imagine it would work really well. Similar velocities in a 30-30. It's just a classic cartridge. Again, lightweight, low cost, etc. So let's talk about a few of the things that I don't particularly care for with this cartridge. Okay, I had to sit down. My knees bothering me. So let's talk about some of the things I don't like. The big one being that rifles available in this cartridge are now very expensive. At one time, Marlin and Winchester lever actions were fairly inexpensive. Now, Marlin and Winchester still manufacture rifles in this cartridge, but they've gotten up there in price, Henry the same way, and even the Rossies. So inexpensive new rifles are not really available. The companies that made the single shots, says New England Firearms H&R, are defunct now, but there are a lot of used rifles out there available in the cartridge. And with so many rifles having been manufactured, if nobody made a new one from this point forward, ammunition would still have to be available for the next 100 years to feed the millions of rifles that are already out there. But I would like somebody to start manufacturing less expensive lever action in 30-30. I thought that the answer was a Mossberg 464, and it just didn't last very long. It shared a lot of the same lines as the Winchester 94. I'm told there were some reliability issues, but I've never fired one myself. And of the people I know that owned one, it was a mixed bag. Some really liked them and some didn't. But that, again, a lot of used rifles out there, things like that. So that's a small dislike, but it is a dislike. I wish that there were more Spitzer style bullets available for the 30-30. I know it's tied up in patents and things like that. Hornady offers the flex tip in two bullet weights, a monolithic 140 grain and a lead cord 160 grain. They also offer them as components for reloading, and there are powders out there specifically for reloading. But I'd like to see other offerings, and as of yet, no one offers a lever action safe pointed bullet besides Hornady. But that's a small one, considering most of the shots are going to be under 150 yards. It's really not that big a deal. But if you want to stretch a little bit, you're stuck with the Hornady bullets, which is not a bad option, but it'd be nice to have more options. Okay. That's really about it as far as what I don't like about the 30-30. Um, One minor one, and I alluded to this earlier. A 30-30 has been considered for years a good rifle for starting young children, and I'm not really sure that it is. Because of the weight, the fact that a lot of the guns have hard butt plates, etc., it's not always that great. Back when I started deer hunting, when you had to be 12, 13 years old to deer hunt, take your hunter safety course and all of that, it was a better option. But now that kids can start as young as 5 or 6 years old, I don't think I would want a 6-year-old shooting my 30-30. But it's still a decent option for women, for teenagers, etc. And it's not a dig on the cartridge, it's a dig on what people think the cartridge is for. And that's really it. If you're okay with the range capabilities and you just want to shoot a classic cartridge, or you want something with enough thump for whitetails and mild recoil, or you've just got a classic old rifle sitting in your gun safe that you haven't shot in a long time, you'd be hard pressed to find a better cartridge for whitetail deer at standard whitetail ranges. And it'll also stretch out and shoot some bigger stuff. I saw an article one time with Marlin 336 and 3030. It was an ad, and it said, "Such a good rifle, most deer hunters never forget it, and neither do most deer." And with a 30-30, that is the case. Most deer hunters never forget it, and neither do most deer. Most deer hunters have killed a deer with a 30-30. I can finally say that I'm one of them. I've got multiple uncles and cousins that started deer hunting with 30-30s, and I've never heard anyone have anything bad to say about a 30-30 other than maybe its range. And though it's not a 300 or 400 yard gun, for most hunting in North America, it's more than capable, range-wise. And for the eastern half of the United States and whitetail deer, it's great. I would say that it would probably even be a good cartridge for moose in the Northeast, such as Maine and places like that, where your shots are going to be close. A viable cartridge. Not a good cartridge, but a viable cartridge. It's certainly used to take feral hogs and black bears and things of that nature. Joseph von Benedict just did a podcast on Ron Spomer Outdoors and talked about bear cartridges and mentioned a 30-30 was a great black bear cartridge. And I can't see why it wouldn't be. If I was ever lucky enough to draw a black bear tag here in Missouri, that's probably the rifle I would shoot because of its quick handling characteristics and the fact that my shots are going to be fairly close. My 30-06 would be fine, but I'd like to be able to get some quick backup shots on a large, potentially dangerous animal as it leaves after it's shot. I'd like to be able to get a few quick backup shots. So a 30-30 would be a good option. Go ahead and post in your comments your impressions of the 30-30, your experiences with the 30-30, etc. Again, I've never really heard anybody say anything bad about it. The worst things I've ever heard is, well, it's not as good as my 308, or it's not as flat shooting as my 30-06. Well, it wasn't intended to be. And for what it does it really well. So if you have a 30-30 or you're considering buying one, find a good bullet that it likes. Practice with it and enjoy the back straps. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please love this episode. Please like and subscribe. and I'll see you next time.